Hello. So we are live now today to speak to you about some of the changes that have been made to the Irish exemption criteria that we found out about yesterday. The announcement was made by Minister McHugh yesterday. So we're going to talk you through kind of our stance on a lot of the changes and maybe explain some of the changes today. I'm Amy Smith. I am the Information and Advocacy Coordinator with the Dyslexia Association. And we're very lucky to be joined by our CEO, Rosie, today, who was obviously very in high demand yesterday on the news and everything. So we're delighted to have you. Just to preface this, we'll probably be doing the live for about 15 to 20 minutes. So if you do have a question specifically about Irish exemptions, put it in the comment section now, and I'll be reading them out as we go along. So if you have any particular questions about the changes or anything that you might kind of be interested about or curious about, let us know and we'll try to answer them as best we can.
Great. Thanks, Amy. So listen, I suppose today has been yesterday was a long time coming. Yeah. We have been working on this for so many years. As many people know, the old circular are there for pretty much 25 years and obviously had gotten increasingly confusing and out of date and not in line with the current research. So I suppose, look, we've been advocating for change for a long time, and finally we were delighted to see that in the last, I suppose about 2 years ago, I think, when the department kicked off the beginnings of this review, which then obviously led into the big public consultation. And I suppose, look, one of the things we really want to say is to our members and everyone who took part in that consultation, a huge thank you. It was, they had an overwhelming response, and I think obviously the strength of that and obviously our pressure and meetings with the department, you know, we really have, I suppose, fought hard on behalf of our kids with dyslexia to get them some positive changes into the accommodations. So let's kick in, and I suppose one of the big things that we talked about, and certainly in some of the media interviews yesterday was a big focus. One of the big changes is now that you won't require a psychological assessment report in order to make an application for Irish exemption. And obviously this is something really we would strongly welcome. And it's been, I suppose it's also moving in line with changes that have happened similarly with regard to exam accommodations and things like that. We know from the research that you know, it's not necessary to be to have an IQ score, and I suppose also having the psychological report was very linked with the IQ score of 90. Was a prior criteria. We know that IQ is not meaningfully linked with dyslexia, and therefore I think removing this requirement for the assessment and just having more of a focus on the impact of dyslexia on a student, what their needs are, being I suppose a key criteria now for whether they get it or not. One of the big reasons we were so welcoming obviously was also that psychological assessment was a huge financial barrier for so many families. As most of you know, getting an assessment through school is really, really challenging. There is only able to get a very small number each year, and obviously that's for any kind of difficulty, not just dyslexia. So the reality is, like, the majority of parents end up going to get their kids assessed privately, maybe not once, sometimes multiple times. Never mind if you have multiple kids with dyslexia, which is quite common given it's genetic. So I think removing this added financial burden of the assessment being compulsory to apply for the exemption is really important.
Yeah, and I think as well, the IQ aspect of it for us was a big issue, because it often knocked some dyslexic kids completely out of the running for an Irish exemption. So for example, if you met all of the old criteria but happened to have an IQ of 89, which in material differences is no different from an IQ of 90 in terms of your function and your ability to learn, you would then automatically be nowhere near getting an Irish exemption. So it kind of left a lot of dyslexic children in almost a no man's land around Irish exemption, where they met all the other criteria, but it was just a very arbitrary number that kind of knocked them out of that process.
Yeah, and I suppose that we also know that kids with dyslexia often have very spiky profiles. You'll know this from your own children's assessment reports. They can have strengths in some areas, sometimes really strong strengths in some areas, but weaknesses in other areas. And if their weaker areas pull their overall score down to like an 88 or 89, it's not really, it's just a pure kind of averaging of the scores. It's not really very reflective of either your kid's strengths or their weaknesses.
Yes. Yeah, so I think that was a huge win. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, I know we have some questions in around whether or not a child should still receive an assessment and still receive a diagnosis. So we want to be very clear on that. So we're saving that just for the questions portion. So we will discuss that in a few minutes. But I suppose removing the barrier to accessing an Irish exemption by needing a new assessment or an assessment in general is a big change, and we're pretty happy with it. Mm-hmm. So the second point that we really quite strongly lobbied for would be the creation of an independent appeals board around Irish exemption. So prior to this, we would advise parents to go to the principal, and if the principal denied an Irish exemption for whatever reason, we advise then to go to the Board of Management and then to make a complaint to the Department of Education. But there was no clear structure around that. There was no rules in place in terms of a time frame for the appeals, what an appeal would look like, and how to overturn a decision that was made. So often parents are really feeling in the dark in relation to that, and we couldn't help them either, because there was no rules laid out for us. So we really lobbied quite hard in relation to this, because we anecdotally heard of parents who went down legal routes, which is obviously very expensive. We also heard of parents going to the Children's Ombudsman to deal with that, and it's obviously no place for a child to be kind of fighting it through legal structures to get support that they are entitled to. So we're delighted with the overall kind of picture we've gotten of the appeals system. So it'll hopefully be a board that will meet twice a year. And we'll go through some of maybe the more complex cases in relation to Irish exemption, maybe if there's some confusion around whether or not an Irish exemption should be granted. It just means that a child will only be kind of waiting about 6 months, we hope, kind of in worst case scenario, for resolution to it. So again, that's something that at least you're going to have some concrete and clear mechanisms and pathways if you're having difficulty accessing an Irish exemption.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was one that really we fought hard for, because it wasn't in. Yeah. The first draft of the circulars that came out last autumn had really no appeals mechanism beyond the school. And obviously we know from experience, and unfortunately the experience of our members, that really that was critical. So it's something we did really advocate strongly for on your behalves, to have that kind of fail-safe for if just, you can't reach an agreement locally. I suppose one of the other things in the circular or certainly what was announced yesterday by the Minister, is they have brought back the age threshold for when you can apply back to second class. Now, I suppose this is a kind of one that we're still maybe not completely happy about, frankly. The draft proposal that came out last autumn, they were proposing third class, and we strongly advocated against this, because essentially you're talking about leaving kids failing, struggling, their self-esteem, plummeting, getting more and more confused between two languages. So I suppose, look, we fought strongly to get that back, and certainly we were delighted yesterday to see that it's come back to at least second class. Look, we'd love that to come back a little bit more perhaps, but certainly we're ticking that off as a win anyway, and certainly we're better than we were this time last year with it. So yeah, I think it's welcome, but kind of cautiously, not quite perfect. But
I think the department kind of suggested that, again, in relation to written homework with Irish, they're hoping to create a system where it's mostly oral and oral Irish up until second class. So the thought process behind that, in terms of where they are, was the child would engage with oral and oral Irish, and then things like the spelling tests or the written homework would start to kick in around second class, at which point then you can make use of your Irish exemption. Now, again, we would say to parents, if that's not what's happening in your school, there is a conversation that needs to be had around that. If your child looks like they meet Irish exemption criteria and are maybe in first class and are getting kind of quite a bit of Irish homework, or are having to do Irish spelling tests and things like that you're unhappy with, again, you can go back to the department guidelines around Irish and say, listen, I think that it is supposed to be more oral and oral. It's hard to say.
They're very difficult words. They're very tricky words.
You want the focus to be maybe more on that, because that is the intention, that when it starts to get into the written work, then someone can make use of their exemption if they have one.
Yeah, and in fairness, I suppose, look, it's reasonable to give kids an opportunity and see how they get on. We don't want, I suppose, no one probably wants a situation where like kids with dyslexia are not allowed to do Irish, where it's like automatic. That's in no one's interest.
Yeah. So one of really the biggest changes for us is that prior to this, so with old Irish exemption criteria, the criteria that you needed to meet was you had to be at or below the 10th percentile of a standardized score in two kind of standardized tests, one of which had to be word reading. And that proved really problematic for us because really, if you speak to an educational psychologist, what they will tell you is that the first thing that a child with dyslexia, when they start working on their phonics and when they start working on their sight words, the first score to improve is word reading. So if you think about dyslexia as a literacy difficulty, which really kind of is resistant to support and is resistant to extra learning, the first thing to improve would be word reading. So whereas spelling and things like that will lag behind in terms of improvement, word reading is the first thing to improve on. So we often had children who had quite severe dyslexia who were really struggling in a situation where they then kind of were at the 11th percentile or the 12th percentile just in word reading and were at the 5th percentile in everything else. So again, it wasn't really even just a good indicator of how well that child would cope with Irish or is coping in English. It was just that they've received extensive support, maybe at home or in other classes, that meant that they've just managed to get their score above that. So a huge change that's happened now is that you need one score at or below the 10th percentile, but in one of three tests. So you can have word reading, you can have reading comprehension, or you can have spelling. Now for us, that's a much bigger indicator of an overall dyslexic problem. So I think that really a lot of children who may have even 2 months ago not met the criteria for an Irish exemption will now be in with a better chance of getting it. Do you think?
Absolutely. And I think it recognises, and this was, I suppose, a strong part of our discussions when we had meetings with the department, is talking about the spectrum of dyslexia. You know, it affects kids differently. And those of you who have more than one child with dyslexia will absolutely recognise this. For some, it may be more word reading. For some, it may have more of a longer term impact on comprehension. For some, it's more spelling and the written word. Some, yes, it might be kind of across the board.
Yeah.
But I think it's a way to recognise that dyslexia is not just about a reading difficulty. And I suppose the other thing, as you say, Amy, about the tests as well, yes, word reading is often the one that can come up first because of all the input that they get in terms of reading. But also the word reading tests are often not timed, and I suppose what you don't see in a word reading test result is how long that took a child to do. So sometimes, and again, our psychologists would see this because they're assessing every week here with us. You might see a child who puts a huge amount of effort and strain and maybe gets sort of scrapes over the 10th percentile, the 11th or the 12th, but they've put a huge amount of effort and took maybe 3-4 times as long as a kid who was more fluent with literacy. So I think it's that sometimes you really have to look at the actual what test was done, what it was actually measuring, what it wasn't measuring, and also it's really important to look at how the child approached it and how long it took as well.
Yeah. So they're really kind of the big changes as far as we're concerned. We do think that it's a more holistic kind of attitude and approach towards Irish exemptions. Obviously, we will need to look at the circular in relation to how it's going to be implemented. There are reviews built in, so I know in relation to the independence appeal mechanism, it will be reviewed in 2 years' time, and we'll take kind of great interest in looking at, you know, how many appeals are successfully contested, and in relation to just how it's working in general. So we will be keeping a really big eye, and we're happy to support parents and teachers in relation to this transition, because as Rosie said earlier, it has been 25 years in relation to the old circular, so this is going to be a huge change. So there is going to be a little bit of confusion, a little bit of everyone finding their feet, which is more, which is definitely natural in relation to this. The schools are receiving the circulars in September, so we hope to have kind of access to them and kind of figure out in relation to really the nitty-gritty of what's going on.
Absolutely. The devil is in the details. So yeah, we'll hopefully probably look at doing another Facebook Live once the circulars come out, and we've maybe taken literally a day. We will be sitting over them with highlighters and a fine-tooth comb, and then obviously hopefully give yes, absolutely. But hopefully then we can give everyone kind of a good, clear overview of exactly what is in the final circulars, because obviously we're talking today based on the comments from the Minister's press release.
Yeah. So we have a few questions here, so we're going to go through them again while we're going through the questions. If you have any specific questions about the changes around Irish exemption, please pop them in the comment box. We are looking at them and we can answer them as best we can. So what's the first one there, Rosie?
So first one, Amy, is we've had a number of people asking, will any existing Irish exemptions be affected? So people who've gotten it already.
Yeah, so I've been answering some questions like this on the phone today and yesterday, and the answer is no. So any Irish exemptions that you have, if your child has an Irish exemption that they have enacted, it will absolutely not be affected. So once an Irish exemption is granted, that's you for life. So again, if you're given an Irish exemption when you were 7 and you're now 15, that Irish exemption is the same and it stays. It is not affected by any changes made to Irish exemption criteria. So your child will not be affected. You do not need to get them reassessed with the school. You do not need to check their standardised scores. Nothing will be affected with Irish exemptions that were granted prior to the changes that have been made yesterday.
Very clear. So it's just new applications that are affected.
Yes, just new applications that are affected, and often children maybe, if you would like to look back, if you were told by your psychologist that you were very close to Irish exemption criteria, it may be worth maybe looking back through your scores. You should be able to find a word reading score, a spelling score, and a reading comprehension score. They would be quite standard tests in a psychological report, and see if you are close. And if you are close, it may be a good idea in September to approach your child's teacher or the principal of your child's school and say, listen, I think that I was very close, my child is very close in relation to this, and with the new criteria, I think they may now fit into that category.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have the next question, and that is, do I need an educational assessment for my child at all now? So is there any need for an educational assessment?
And obviously we've, again, another one, we've had a few questions about this. There are a few comments on some of the media stories as well. I suppose we really are very much looking at this is around decoupling. So these changes to the Irish exemption criteria are essentially decoupling, breaking the link between assessment and accessing a criteria, okay? So it's about making that access as open to people as possible, even if you're waiting for an assessment through NEPs in the school, which can take years, or you can't afford to get a private one yet. If the evidence is there, your kid can still access the accommodations that they need, okay? In terms of, do you still need an assessment, a diagnosis for dyslexia? Absolutely, okay? We are strong advocates of that. We think it's really important for children, for their parents, and for their teachers to have a name for this, difficulty, to have a name, to give an understanding, to learn about a student's profile, to get ideas about what may be the right paths for them, to get support from the psychologist or a specialist teacher on, the best way to navigate the education system for your child in terms of what's to be done at school, help at home, accessing things outside of school. So absolutely, we are and remain strong advocates of assessment. It's really, really important.
Yeah, I think we do need to be very clear in relation to that. International best practice, so we usually look towards the UK. Scotland in particular is quite a forerunner in relation to equitable access to assessment. Now, in relation to what happens there and what we're seeing kind of best practice internationally is that you would be assessed maybe once or twice in your entire lifetime, and that would give you a diagnosis of dyslexia. So the fact that you are maybe diagnosed when you were 7, I'm a child of the 90s, so I think I was assessed probably about 10 times in my lifetime. And obviously that's massively inappropriate. Now we know that once you have dyslexia, you always have dyslexia. It's a lifelong condition. So it's something that you will always have. So again, what we look towards now is maybe getting a child assessed at 7 or 8 that confirms their diagnosis of dyslexia, and then they do not have to be assessed by a psychologist. Again, unless you personally want to spend that money and you personally want to see where they're at in terms of their abilities. But from there, it's working with teachers, it's looking at the standardized tests that they can do in school to see how they're coping, how they're getting on, and checking in at different intervals. But there's no need to spend €800, €600 on an assessment to confirm that they still have dyslexia. But that initial assessment is so important. I know I'm such a legal nerd, but it is important to say that dyslexia is one of the recognised disabilities under the Disability Act in Ireland, which means that if you have a diagnosis of dyslexia, you can't be discriminated against because of your dyslexia in the workplace. There's huge supports at college in relation to dyslexia, which is very person-centered. So again, the importance of having a diagnosis to be able to say to someone, listen, I'm dyslexic, I have proof of my dyslexia, and therefore you cannot discriminate against me. You have to put supports in place in the workplace, really is huge. Not to mention the fact that we run Dyslexia and Me here, and every time I have a Dyslexia and Me, I'm reminded that I think there's a huge conversation around labelling children. But my personal opinion as a dyslexic is that you're just swapping out the label that maybe they've already given themselves. So sometimes they get called lazy or they're not trying hard enough. But instead you're saying, no, we see that you're trying very hard. It's that you have dyslexia, you learn differently. So again, it can't be overstated that we do feel that that initial assessment to confirm a diagnosis of dyslexia is so important.
Oh, absolutely, I totally agree. And I think it's kind of in line with, let's say, the affirmative model of disability. And I love the phrase, it's about finding your tribe. Okay, so if someone has never, maybe you're having all the classic dyslexic difficulties, but no one has ever used that word with you, then you don't know to contact the Dyslexia Association. You're not able to have a chat with another kid in your class, or for a mom at the school gate with another parent to talk about it, if no one has ever mentioned that word. So there's huge, while a word is really just an umbrella term, but it enables you to find your tribe, and so it's so important. So
it's definitely gotten rid of the idea that we need to be assessed every 2 years. I think that the come back to me in 2 years, reassessment in 2 years thing, I know was on all of my reports, but it's definitely not international best practice anymore. There's no need to get a full psychological assessment on your child regularly. Your child has dyslexia, they will remain having dyslexia. Their dyslexia will take different forms throughout their lifetime, but their dyslexia will stay there with them. So again, there's no need to constantly be updating reports. I suppose that kind of leads us on to one of the questions that really we don't have an answer to, but we wanted to say it out loud.
We don't know everything, Amy.
We don't know everything.
Not yet.
But one of the questions that we have gotten, I know that we have Sue who was asking a question as well about whether or not how you know a child is at the 10th percentile without getting them reassessed. So one of the questions we have, will they be using the STEM scores from the classroom tests that they do?
Like the Drumcondra test.
Yeah, like the Drumcondras. And the answer is we don't know. So there is a possibility, like they do with race at second level, which is reasonable accommodations. They do the same tests really that we have here. So they do the RAT or the Wyatt. So they have access to those tests now. And they may do those and then see if a child is at or around the 10th percentile on those tests. Or there is a possibility that they may be looking at the Drumcondras. The answer is we don't know yet. Until we have the circular and we see the list of approved materials, approved testing materials, we can't say. As soon as we get the circular, we will go through it again like we've done here. We'll go through everything we have and we'll be able to let you know the list of approved tests. But again, there's really two possibilities in relation to that. What possibility A is that they will use the Drumcondras and those STEM tests. Possibility B is that they will use some of the tests that we have here that we know that teachers do have access to.
Yeah. And I suppose the big difference between the two kinds of tests is the Drumcondra sort of tests that they do with whole classes. They're a group test, and the other tests like the RAT or the Wyatt are ones that are usually done, they're pretty almost done on an individual basis. So they would be the kind of tests that maybe would be done by a special education, a special ed teacher, a learning support teacher, or maybe at second level even a guidance counsellor, but it would be done kind of an individualised test. So they're a little bit more in-depth than, we'll say, the group standardised tests like the Drumcondras that are done periodically on the whole class. So yeah, we await with interest, and certainly we do hope that there is some comment that will give clarity to that question.
Yeah, so Sue, I hope that answers your question. There's no need to get your child reassessed. Again, we will have more information in September on how they will assess your child, but again, it will be done in school. So your teacher will either look at particular individual tests that they will then have access to, and they will have support from NEPS as well. So the National Educational Psychological Service will give them background support in relation to administering those tests. or they will be interpreting the drumcondras. We're not sure yet. As soon as we know, we will let you know. But again, there's no need to get your child reassessed to figure out whether or not they're at or below the 10th percentile. So I hope that was clear.
Yeah, and I think, look, obviously, I suppose, and this is why we're planning our next Facebook Live. So once the circulars come out, and hopefully we will all have some more clarity at that stage, and we'll be able to give you clearer guidance, you know, assuming the circular is nice and clear in that regard.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is my favorite question. Are you ready?
Yes. Okay.
Go
for it.
What careers do you need Irish for in relation to parents making like a fully informed decision around exemption?
Okay, actually, very, very few. Okay, the biggie really is primary teaching. Okay, Irish is a compulsory subject for primary teaching, and even if you have an exemption, that doesn't count. If Irish is a core component and a course requirement for a course, then an exemption doesn't get you out of that. But really, you're only talking primary teaching, maybe an actual degree in Irish, or for example, I know in NUI Galway they do some degrees through Irish. So there's very limited numbers like that. In terms of careers, again, it's very, very limited. So classic ones that come up would be, we'll say, like the guards and the civil service.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not actually compulsory to have Irish. If you do have Irish and you're applying for a civil service or public service job, you can evidence competency in that, and you do get some sort of points in their recruitment process, but it's not actually essential.
Yeah, there's extra points, and there's also the option to be, say, posted to a Gaeilgeoir area, maybe if you're from there or things like that. But again, it's not a necessity in relation to applying to be a civil servant in any echelon of the civil service. In relation to the guards, it's my favourite because I've been
done a lot of work.
Yeah, I've been down with the guards. So I've been working extensively with guards over the last 2.5 years, and have done a few trips down to Templemore. And I suppose the answer in relation to An Garda Síochána is that you need 2 languages. That's the entrance criteria. So you need English and another language. Now that other language can be French, German, Spanish, Chinese, Polish, Japanese, anything. It doesn't have to be Irish. There's a small Irish component in relation to say passing out within the guards. Now this is an oral component and is also taken from beginner level. So if someone was Italian and they came here and they wanted to be a guard, they would again be in the same class as someone who was dyslexic and never did Irish. And they would learn how to do the module together, and they would both learn some oral Irish in relation to arresting someone and cautioning someone in Irish, things like that. And they will have to pass that module, but again, there are people who have never done Irish who are doing that and are doing enough to pass that. So again, you do not need English and Irish to become a guard, you just need 2 languages. So they can be any languages, one of which is English, so you don't need Irish to be a guard. But there are some of the ones that we get kind of questions around the civil service and things like that. You don't need it for secondary school teaching either. So you just need it for the obviously if you want to be an Irish secondary school teacher, it will be
but actually there was a really interesting piece in the news only recently, actually, and of all these civil servants that actually, like, the percentage that actually have like complete competence in Irish is minuscule, you know. So again, just sort of the vast majority of our civil servants are wholly working through English, with obviously each department usually has, a couple of individuals, and obviously certain departments, particularly obviously the department that has the Gaeltacht division, will obviously have a much higher percentage as well. But yeah, it's absolutely not. It's lesser and lesser. And in relation to the guards, I would say we have been and we will continue to be advocating for the removal of a second language entry requirement into the guards, because it is a challenge for people with dyslexia. Obviously, for some of them, having any second language is a difficulty. So we will keep kind of, plugging away with our advocacy work on that. It's interesting that actually it's out of line with, for example, the requirements in the Army, because if you're applying for the Army, if you have an exemption from Irish in school, they'll recognise that and give you dispensation from a second language requirement. So I suppose we would like to see something similar to be brought in for the guards.
Yeah, just to be more in
terms of entry requirements anyway.
Yeah, so in relation, we've actually got a really good question in around languages as well. So it's the question is, does the exemption take effect or affect modern languages in secondary schools? So this is a really good question. The answer is that modern languages are not a core requirement for the Leaving Cert. So you do not have to, they're not mandatory, you do not have to do them. Now, in the vast majority of secondary schools, they ask you to do it at least up to third year. And that's just around really timetabling and things like that. So everyone kind of does it. But after third year, a lot of children, not just children with dyslexia, sometimes stop doing them. So you do need Irish, or you do need a modern language to get into any of the NUIs. Which is the National Universities of Ireland. However, if you have an Irish exemption, you fill out what's called a matriculation form. You can do that anytime after third year. And that means that they will take your Irish exemption as also an exemption from the need to do a modern language. So it means that you do not need to have Irish or a modern language when you're entering any of the NUIs as their kind of base criteria. So it gets rid of that need. Now, if your child does not want to go to any of the NUIs, or say, for example, wants to go to DCU or DIT or any of the ITs, they do not require you to have a modern language, so you do not need to have a modern language. I will say that sometimes children really enjoy learning a modern language, and some children find it easier than Irish in some scenarios. In addition, it's really important to look at the reasons why we have an Irish exemption. So we have the Irish exemption because your child is really having such a hard time with their English language, that learning two grammar structures and two phonics structures is very difficult for them at that time. So again, if you're granted an Irish exemption at 9 years old, by the time you're 12 or 13 and you're entering secondary school, your English hopefully has improved to a level where it may be a good idea for you to look and be excited about learning new languages. Again, some languages are easier than others. We found research that would suggest that things like Spanish or Italian are easier to learn because, again, their grammar structures are easier and their pronunciation are a little bit easier for and more phonetic, kind of, more consistent for people with dyslexia. But again, it really is up to you and your child to discuss. But again, modern languages are not a core requirement under the Leaving Cert. You do have to have a minimum of 6 subjects for your Leaving Cert, so you need to make sure that your child is at least doing the 6 subjects. But again, if you have an Irish exemption, you can fill out the matriculation form, which means that you're not limiting at all any of the colleges that you may want to attend.
I suppose the one thing you want to watch out with in terms of other languages is just the detail of particular courses your child might be applying for, because occasionally there will be maybe, let's say, a business course that has a minor module in a modern language. So just to kind of make sure when they come to filling out their CEO in 6th year that you drill down not just to the general entry requirements, but actually to the detailed requirements for each course they're putting on their form. So just to make sure you don't miss out.
You can't study law and French.
No, if you don't have French, absolutely, or European studies, etc.
Yeah, so it is important to look. But again, I will also say that places like, I know in particular Maynooth have taken away that Irish, that modern language criteria for some of their particular courses. So again, if your child has a very career trajectory that they want to be on, look in and see. I know that social care is one of the ones that Maynooth has removed the language requirement for. We just have another question here in relation to can the school look for an assessment report in order to provide a support for child? So I suppose a diagnosis of dyslexia is not necessarily required.
No. The new system, well, I suppose, look, the new system, it's what we're a year into it now in terms of the new model for SEN provision in schools with this kind of weighted model by sort of geographic and analysis and things like this. So schools get their allocation and only in cases where a child had maybe very significant, very complex needs or perhaps multiple disabilities, would there be maybe an individual application. So for the vast majority of kids with dyslexia, their support is coming out of the special education needs allocation that the school has. So, and the department has issued guidelines both for primary and post-primary schools in terms of, how they should look at using that time, making sure it gets to the kids who need it the most, and being flexible about it as well. So it's not about, I think sometimes it's easy, for you get caught up in the numbers, it's like, how much time is my kid getting, how many days a week, etc. And it's more about, I suppose, ideally you want to have a good relationship with the school so that they're getting the help that they need, but the help that they need may be different at different times. So there may be times where they don't need any help. There may be times where a small group class occasionally is fine. There may be a time where they need even 1 or 2 one-to-ones if they're having a particular difficulty. So, and I think that was, I suppose, kind of one of the rationale with the model was going away from the provision model in schools is going away from individual allocations and allowing schools in discussion with parents, and having that kind of, holistic approach of what is best meets the needs of a child at a given time.
Yeah, so we hope that that's kind of answered your question. We have one more question here, and that is there any reference to Gael Scullin in the circular? So the answer is no.
Aside from the fact that they don't come under the circular, really. Yeah, the circular, well, we don't have the circular yet.
It was explicitly clear.
It's explicit for English medium schools only.
Yeah, so this will cover English medium schools only, and it was kind of explicitly laid out in the statement that we've received from the Minister that it only governs English speaking schools. So we hope that we've answered all of your questions. We are going to arrange another Facebook Live to kind of comb through when we have the circular and we've really that detail in relation to how they're going to decide on the percentile ranking, what tests they're going to use, and maybe how to have that conversation and maybe approaching the school to say, listen, I think that my child meets criteria in relation to an Irish exemption. So again, we will let everyone know when that's going to be, and you can start posting in the comments underneath what questions you would like to have answered. I think yesterday, on the whole, was a pretty good day.
Absolutely.
It definitely was.
It was a nice surprise on Monday morning, I think.
It was. Yeah. Myself and Rosie texting each other at 7:30 in the morning was a good start to our day. But yeah, I think that it was the combination of really a huge amount of effort on behalf of us, but also on behalf of all of the parents who have really been pushing for this almost for about 25 years.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think that there is a huge amount to be said for the lobbying and the consistent work that's being done in relation to making schools a much more inclusive and a really progressive and holistic place for your children to be. So we do think that what we have going forward in September, definitely on the face. Now, obviously, we have to dig in a little bit around it, but on the face of it is a huge improvement on where we were, and definitely provides a much fairer approach to dyslexia and your child's needs. So thank you so much for joining us. We're going to pin this Facebook Live to the top of our page so you can watch it back, and we will let you know as soon as we know when we'll have the circular, when we're going to have a day that we're going to go through it and answer all of your questions. Thank you so much.
Talk to you again. Bye.